braved the weather to attend this site visit. I hope, and I'm sure it was very useful. Warm welcome to the members of the public at the back. We don't have any speakers, so we'll go on and attend to the agenda straight away. Procedural items first, as usual, declaration of interest. None, thank you. Confirmation of minutes. Will someone propose and second it? Stan? Ray, thank you. Substitute members. Thank you. And just to mention that Councillor Mulholland is still in Christie's.
Collins was supposed to be substituting for Liz Owens.
But he's not in attendance.
Sorry.
Decision items, planning matters. We can go straight to item 1 on the agenda, which takes us to Great Birchwood at Wharton. A complex report before you. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll warn members in advance that this is quite a long presentation, but largely due to the complexity of the issues that this application raises. Several of our members were on the site visit this morning, so they'll be familiar with the site and its surroundings. It's Great Birchwood Country Park, which is broadly equidistant within the green belt between Lytham and Wharton. And the application is in outline with matters of access, layout and scale applied for a development, redevelopment of the site, the demolition of existing buildings and removal of structures, and up to 30 dwellings following the site's clearance. So just to provide some wider context, the whole area within this screenshot is within the green belt. So the site sits broadly centrally within this oval-shaped parcel here, where we've got the junction with West End Lane and Lodge Lane that members travelled up this afternoon or this morning to look back towards the site. Several existing buildings that I'll refer to later in the presentation. The main thoroughfare is along Lytham Road to the south. This is also where the present access is. We've got 3 buildings associated with what's presently a vacant poultry farm here to the southeast corner, and then the golf driving range, and this is kind of a netted area which forms the range here to the west of the site. This woodland is protected by a tree preservation order, and I've marked the red line boundary of the application site on here. So in terms of the site itself, we've got a series of existing buildings starting at the southern end. We've got 2 bungalows here. These were originally approved as kennels and cattery, subsequently extended and converted over time. And we've got this dome-shaped barn that then feeds into 3 existing stable buildings to the southeast corner. Open areas to the southwest and to this central grazing paddock here. This is parcel 3 parcel C of the development that I'll refer to later in the presentation. This area has an extant permission for touring and static caravans. Again, I will specify that later in the presentation. This is a building that was approved as craft units that still exists on the site. We've got the main clubhouse, which is a split level 2 and single story building, and then the TPO woodland that's lapsed, and there's areas of clearings in places at the moment. There's also a series of retained caravans and lodges on the site, but this is much less than what the extant permission would allow. We've also got the gun club building. So this is a shooting range that was approved in the mid-1980s up to the northern part of the site. So just some photos here of the site and its surroundings. So we've got the main access from Lytham Road. There's a ghost island right-hand filter lane into the site and a priority junction onto the main road. These walls are to be set back to allow footways on either side. So running south into the site, so this is the southwest corner on the left-hand side of the access as you come in. We've got an existing pond within this area, and then this area of grassed open space. The existing barn is this dome-shaped structure here, and then you've got these lower-level stables in front of it. There's also an application extant permission to extend these stables, again, that I'll touch on later in the presentation. You can see the relationship with this is the northernmost building on the poultry farm and the fence that divides the two sites here. So you can see the relationship between the poultry farm and that barn. And it's here to the southeast corner. You've then got two bungalows immediately to the west of those barn and stable buildings. So these were originally kennels and catteries. They've been extended and converted to houses due to subsequent planning permissions. This is the central and southern area of the site. And immediately to the north of those, you've got this open grazing paddock. So this is parcel C of the development that's referred to in the report, and I'll touch on that later in the presentation. You can also see the craft units and the clubhouse in the background. So this is the craft unit building, timber-clad, single-storey building, and then the clubhouse, which is the tallest building on the site. To the north of that, split level 2-storey, there's a single-storey section that then follows on further to the north. These are some of the existing lodges and caravans on the site. Again, single-storey units. And the gun club building up to the northern boundary. So you can see the planting's quite scattered and sporadic along this northern boundary, and then it merges into the TPO woodland that sits to the northwest of the site. This is a view through a gap in a gate on Lytham Road to the southeast of the site. So you have to go and seek these views. You don't get these views immediately from the road. There's quite a tall roadside hedgerow as you pass on Lytham Road, but this is one of the gaps in the site. You can see the poultry farm buildings here. So this is the eastern boundary that we're looking at, this thin linear belt of landscaping, and there's a mound behind this around 2.5 metres high. You can see the existing dome-shaped barn and the stable buildings here behind that tree line. This is a view from Lytham Road, so on the opposite side of Lytham Road, looking back towards the site. So I'm stood to the southwest, looking back towards the site, and you can see the roadside hedgerow here, and then the rooftop of one of the existing bungalows behind that. Parcel C would be to the north of these bungalows within this area here. So obviously this part of the site presently is quite exposed in these views from Lytham Road as you approach from the west. This is a view from a public right-of-way that borders the estuary. So if you cross over Lytham Road and head south, looking back towards the site, you can see the barn here and the poultry farm, and there's an existing smaller scale industrial unit at the front of the site as well that you can see in the foreground here. And then you've got the clubhouse and the craft units behind it. So you do get visibility from this public right-of-way. That's up on a banking, so it's quite elevated in relation to the site. You can see the TPO woodland here and the golf driving range. So this is the view from the north. Members will be familiar with this from the site visit this morning. You can see the rooftops of the lodges here through the current kind of linear tree line that's on that northern boundary, particularly when those trees aren't in leaf. So you've got the gun club and the roof of that here, and then the existing rooftops of two of the single-storey lodges. Again, looking at it from West End Lane, so Lodge Lane merges into West End Lane further to the east. Again, you can clearly see the roof of the gun club, the roofs of the lodges, and then the taller clubhouse as a backdrop behind. So in terms of a brief history of the site, this is a photograph from the 1940s when the site was used as an RAF base. That also applies to the land to the east and the west. That picture I took through the gate from Lytham Road is effectively this gate here that's still in place, this opening at the moment. This has all been cleared now. The golf driving range buildings broadly centrally here, and the areas are open. And this is the Great Birchwood site. You can see that the woodland is much thicker and denser. That's lapsed over time. But what we can see from this application in 1982, so this is the first application that followed the RAF base. The site has been cleared of all those existing buildings that previously formed part of that use. So this was vacated, the site was cleared, and we're effectively, other than some of these hard standings, starting effectively with a blank canvas during this application in 1982. So that established, first of all, the riding centre and stables on this part of the site, and then a cattery, which has subsequently been converted to a dwelling house on this part of the site. Fast forward to 2009, and you can see here how the site has evolved since that original permission in 1982. So we've now got the two bungalows here at the southern end of the site as you come in, the barn and the three stables on this part of the site that still exists today, that open grazing paddock, the craft units, the clubhouse and the gun club. What I've highlighted here, and as I mentioned to members on the site visit, you've got to bear in mind that there is an extant planning permission that's been implemented for the siting of 49 touring caravan pitches within this area here in the red line, and 46 static caravan pitches in the area within the blue line. So when we visited the site this morning, obviously this site was basically vacant and open. There was nothing sited on here, and then there's a scattering of lodges and a couple of statics up in this area of the site, but nothing like the intensity of the development that has been permitted and implemented by this planning permission. So when we're thinking about benchmarking and we're thinking about the impacts of the development, this is the starting point, what could be done under this planning permission rather than specifically what's been seen this morning. So we've got to keep that in the back of our minds when we think about the impacts of this development. Some of our members would have been on the committee when this application was considered, granted in September 2018. It's now expired. This was again an outline application, albeit that it only included access for a care development. So that included a care home in place of the clubhouse, these extra care single-storey units in place of effectively the caravans that were permitted by that previous permission, mixed-use leisure cafe and shop building on the site of the stables and barn with a bowling green, and then 2 replacement dwellings to replace the existing bungalows here. So really the approach with this application was to try and replicate what was the development on the areas of the site that have been permitted by this application, by locating these buildings on the same parts of the site that already either have buildings or have extant permission for caravans on. So that focused development up to this northern part of the site more intensively, and then kind of almost like a like-for-like replacement of the buildings on these existing parts of the site here. So in terms of the principle of development, the main issue in this case is the impact on the green belt. So I've included this slide just to clarify exactly what the framework says in terms of green belt impact. So a local planning authority should regard the construction of new buildings as inappropriate in the green belt, subject to a series of exceptions. And it's the exception in subparagraph G that's of particular relevance to this application. So I've highlighted the parts of that paragraph that are applicable in this case. So we've got the complete redevelopment of previously developed land, and then there's 2 options which would either not have a greater impact on the openness of the green belt than the existing development, or not cause substantial harm to the openness of the greenbelt, where the redevelopment would reuse previously developed land and contribute to meeting an affordable housing need in the area of the local planning authority. So effectively, what this paragraph allows, this is a circumstance where there's no affordable housing, so your development must not have a greater impact on the openness of the greenbelt. In circumstances where you are contributing to meeting an identified affordable housing need, then the threshold for impact is that it mustn't cause substantial harm to the openness of the greenbelt. So more harm can be caused under the second bullet point than can be caused under the first bullet point. So it presupposes that some harm can happen to the greenbelt in order to deliver affordable housing that meets a need within the area of the local planning authority. So the result of that is that there's three main tests, taking the main parts of that paragraph. First of all, the site being redeveloped must be previously developed land. It must contribute to meeting an identified affordable housing need within the area of the local planning authority. And it's been established through appeal that the word contribute doesn't require the whole of the development to be affordable housing. It only needs to make a contribution. And finally, and most importantly in this particular case, the development must not cause substantial harm to the openness of the greenbelt. So openness, I've taken this phrase from an appeal decision. Openness is a three-dimensional concept which effectively denotes an absence of buildings and development. And then the planning practice guidance advises that openness is capable of having both spatial and visual aspects. So the visual impact of the proposal may be relevant, as could its volume, and that really forms the basis for the assessment in the report and that I've summarised on the rest of the slides. So providing that these three tests here are met, then the development will not be inappropriate in the greenbelt, and it doesn't require very special circumstances to justify it. If it failed to meet any of these three tests, it would require very special circumstances that clearly outweigh the harm to the greenbelt. So the first, whether the site is previously developed land. I've included the full definition from the framework there, but the key parts are identified in bold. So land which is or was occupied by a permanent structure, including the curtilage of the developed land and any associated fixed surface infrastructure. There's then a series of exclusions, and the most important one in respect of the RAF base is that it excludes land that was previously developed, but where the remains of the permanent structure or fixed surface structure have blended into the landscape. So the key issue there for the RAF base is that those buildings were cleared away from the site, and we know from that 1982 application that at the time of that, the site was clear of all those former buildings, and the appearance of the site is largely green space and open at that time, and so the site isn't previously developed land due to the RAF base because that exclusion applies. However, part of the application history includes this application in 1991, which I've shown the site plan here on the left-hand side. The description of that application includes a change of use to country leisure park and phase one, which included a series of log cabins up here to the northern part of the site, the craft units in this area, stable extensions down here which aren't in place but permission remains extant, and various other inclusions which also included what's referred to as the barbecue building, which is effectively the clubhouse. Now this has been extended by subsequent permissions over time to follow a much larger footprint than is shown here. But the key part of this application is that it allows the change of use of the land within the red line to a country leisure park. And by doing that, it establishes the curtilage of the developed land. So all these buildings, this mix of uses, the equestrian uses, what was the cattery and kennels at this time, the craft units, the clubhouse, the holiday caravans, have all been constructed within this single planning unit, which this application allows a change of use of the land to form a collective mix of uses as a country leisure park. So the conclusion is that because of this permission, all these buildings and uses fall within the curtilage of the developed land. So this is the curtilage of Great Birchwood, and by virtue of that, the site as a whole is previously developed land by virtue of establishing that curtilage under that 91 permission. So this is the development that's now being applied for. As I mentioned, access, layout and scale are all applied for at this stage. So we've got 3 distinct parcels that are kind of in these separate, what I've described as islands around this outer estate road that's then connected by these central sections. So we've got 13 dwellings within this northern parcel, 11 within this central parcel, and then 6 within this southern parcel, and as they're referred to as parcels A, B and C in the report. So that's just to show a visual representation of those. There's a total of 9 affordable housing units. So that's the 30% requirement in policy H4. And the SHMA identifies a high level of affordable housing need in the borough. So that this is important to the second test, that the development must contribute to an identified affordable housing need within the local planning authority's area. So we've got a high level of need identified in the local plan through the SHMA. We've got a contribution of 30%, which is in compliance with policy H4. And then we've got this mix of housing, 15 3-bed, 7 4-bed and 8 5-bed, each with their own garage, which satisfies the size criteria of policy H2. So 50% of the dwellings have to be 1 to 3-bed houses. There's a condition on the permission that also relates to the provision of specialist accommodation for the elderly, which is the second part of policy H2, which would come at reserved matters. And then we've got these large areas of open space. So the intention here is to contain the buildings within this central core of development, to set them away from the edges of the site and have these substantial buffers of open space around the fringes. This is effectively the volume comparison that's mentioned in the planning practice guidance. And this slide here is to show an overlay between the existing buildings that are on the site and where the houses would be positioned in relation to those. So you can see the barn and stables, 2 bungalows, craft units, clubhouse, gun club. The red line area is the area that's permitted for 49 touring caravans, and the blue line area is what's permitted for 46 statics. So you can see the strategy here. Parcels A and B are to occupy the same parts of the site that contain the most intensive part of the development that's permitted by that fallback position, the 2009 application. So the dwellings replace the caravans in these buildings. And then on this southern part of the site, this is where there's a trade-off between a scenario, whereas the previous care development application effectively put buildings on the same parts of the site where they already exist. That doesn't make sense with respect to this layout for these dwellings, the uses that are proposed, because you wouldn't want to fragment this parcel of the site by putting, say, 2 dwellings on here and 4 dwellings over here. You'd then have to extend the estate road and increase the spread of development and push it out further to the boundaries. So effectively, what the development on this parcel does is it imagines a situation where these existing buildings actually fall on this part of the site, and it's a trade-off where these parts are returned to open space, and these dwellings are positioned on this parcel to make sure you get this continuous spine running north to south through the site. So these are extracts from the table in the report. So the figures that have been calculated here are based on the fallback position, which allows the extensions to these stables, and the presence of all existing buildings with the exception of the gun club, because there's a separate application in to replace this building on this part of the site down here, albeit that that's not part of this scheme. But to avoid any double counting, that's been excluded from these calculations. The proposed building volume is based on these scale parameters. So we don't have any specific elevations for the dwelling at this stage. It's just a case that these are the maximum heights to eaves and ridge that could be allowed for the dwellings and for the garages. So this maximum building volume is calculated on the basis that this is the maximum that could be allowed, and therefore that feeds into this volume. So we've got a 29.5% increase in volume and just over 5% increase in footprint in comparison to the existing position. Also, this doesn't include the caravans because they aren't buildings. So you've got to think of those separately. Obviously, the caravans do have a bulk and a massing, but they aren't buildings for the purposes of these calculations. So the third test, whether the harm to greenbelt openness is substantial. So there's no definition of what constitutes substantial harm within the framework. It's a matter of planning judgment. As I mentioned before, the strategy here is to include all the development within this central area of the site, and then to give over these peripheral parts of the site to a combination of open space and landscaping. So what that does, it sets the buildings back from the site boundaries so that they're closer within the site rather than appearing on the edges, and it allows significant strengthening of the existing landscaping that members would have seen on site at the moment. We've got the restoration of this TPO woodland in the areas where it's lapsed, and then a play area within the existing clearing. A much thicker belt of landscaping along the remaining perimeter of the site, where it's very thin at the moment, and particularly next to Lytham Road and this area surrounding the ponds, where you get those views through to the site towards this parcel. So really the intention of this is to contain the development within the centre of the site around this landscape fringe, and therefore reduce its visual impact to a level where the harm that's caused to openness is less than substantial. There's a low density to the development between 16 dwellings per hectare and 17.5 dwellings per hectare. So obviously some way below the normal 30 dwellings per hectare that's referred to in the local plan policy. Obviously various reasons for that. And there's also large gaps as a result of that low density. So you get larger gaps between the buildings, a less intensive form of development than that 2009 permission would allow, with the caravans much more closely spaced. And this is really to temper the impacts on openness that arises from the increased footprint, volume and height of the buildings. Obviously all these are 2 stories in height, with potential for rooms in the roof. And so you'd have a greater visual perception of the buildings in comparison to the existing single-storey buildings that exist on the site and the caravans. So this is really to mitigate those impacts, and the fact that these dwellings within this collection here would be on part of the site that's presently open. I mentioned that trade-off between the bungalows and the stables earlier. What this also does, it positions dwellings with active frontages onto the roadside. So you've got outward front-facing dwellings across the road and on towards the open countryside beyond, to avoid back garden fences and other domestic paraphernalia being visible from outside the site. In terms of tree removals, you can see the red circles here on the plan where existing trees are to be removed, principally from that central spine where the development would be located, and then there's a tree up here in the TPO area as well that would need to be removed, but that's massively offset by the substantial increase in woodland planting that we see in the landscape master plan here. And there's a condition on the permission that requires any application for reserve matters, which includes landscaping, to follow the principles in that master plan. So when I refer to the perimeter block structure, that's really there with these dwellings facing out onto the road with the back gardens facing inward to one another, so that you get this active building frontage and the dwellings face out onto the road. In the late observations, we've had updated comments from Natural England in response to an updated shadow habitat regulations assessment that's been provided by the applicant. Natural England's comments advise that that's acceptable in principle. The mitigation identified in there should avoid any adverse effects on the integrity of the Ribble estuary, subject to process called an appropriate assessment being carried out to formalise that mitigation. So that's really a procedural matter of transferring the mitigation that's identified in the shadow habitat regulations assessment to the appropriate assessment template. Subject to that being carried out, and that's part of the resolution, Natural England wouldn't have any objections. In terms of the ecology unit, the Greater Manchester Ecology Unit, one of their issues has been how to connect these existing ponds. So because you're introducing development between these ponds, there needs to be some kind of corridor to maintain a route between them for amphibians. So that's what this wildlife corridor is intended to do. And there'll be an amphibian tunnel underneath the estate road here to make sure there's a connection between these three retained ponds. There are bat roosts within the clubhouse and the craft unit buildings, so protected species licence is required from Natural England, and habitat compensation is marked up here. So there's bat boxes in the trees, and there's bat features incorporated into several of the existing dwellings to provide that habitat compensation, and GMEU was satisfied that that'll ensure that the favourable conservation status of bats isn't prejudiced by the development, and that the three derogation tests in the habitat regulations are satisfied on that basis. In terms of surrounding land uses, the main impact here is whether or not the proposed residential scheme can be integrated with existing land uses successfully to ensure that the amenity of future occupiers isn't harmed and that there isn't any prejudicial impact on the surrounding businesses. So the main impact is from the poultry farm to the southeast corner of the site, and the impacts arising from that are principally due to odour and noise. Because the poultry farm isn't operational at the moment, there's an odour impact assessment that was taken from the 2016 application that effectively said that a buffer of 25 metres between the edge of the development site with the poultry farm needed to be achieved to the closest dwellings to avoid any adverse effect with respect to odour. So I've just marked on that separation distance is actually 47 metres with this layout. So the 25 metre buffer is exceeded to ensure that there won't be any adverse odour impact should this poultry farm recommence trading in the future. There is an ongoing and undetermined application on this site to convert the poultry farm buildings into B8 use, that's storage and distribution. That application isn't determined at present, so we've got to consider this application on the basis of the present circumstances, which allows that use as a poultry farm. But effectively, the mitigation is the degree of separation, and we've got the additional screening from the enhanced landscaping as well, that will ensure that there's sufficient spacing with this existing use, so that there wouldn't be any harm to the amenity of future occupiers or any need for the existing business to alter or have additional restrictions placed on it in accordance with what's referred to as the agent of change principle in the framework. So effectively that means that existing businesses shouldn't be prejudiced by uses that happen after they've already become established, and that's achieved in this case by virtue of that separation. In terms of the access into the site, the existing position of the access is retained. Those walls are set back to allow these 2 metre wide footways into the site, merging with the existing footway on Lytham Road. There's some additional tactile paving provision and this pedestrian refuge that's at the western end of the Ghost Island approach and right-hand filter lane into the site to provide this crossing over to the 2 existing bus stops that are a short distance away from the site access. And these bus stops are also to be improved with shelters and raised boarding curbs. So there's good visibility, 2.5 metres by 150 metres at the junction to allow for the 50-mile-an-hour speed of the road. It's the same priority give-way junction onto Lytham Road with that right-hand turn lane. Trip generation is very limited, estimated 21 and 16 two-way vehicle trips in the AM and PM peaks. So there's no objection from LCC Highways in terms of access, safety or capacity. There's updated comments from LCC Highways as well in the late observations that largely repeat what they said for a different iteration of the scheme. This now has been reduced in terms of the number of dwellings, and so they've got no objections on the basis of the reduced quantum. So the main issue in this case is the development's impact on the green belt. I referred to those 3 tests earlier in the presentation. The first being that the site must be previously developed land in order to qualify for the exception in paragraph 149G of the framework. That 1991 permission establishes the change of use of the whole of the site and therefore establishes the curtilage within which all of the uses have emerged over time, and so the site is considered to be previously developed land as a whole by virtue of falling within that curtilage. The scheme makes a 30% contribution towards meeting an identified affordable housing need in the local authority's area, and so the determinative issue is whether or not it would cause substantial harm to the openness of the green belt. Now this table here identifies the main sources of harm to the green belt and then the mitigation that's put in place to address those harms. So the main issues are the increased volume and the height of the dwellings. Obviously putting 2-storey dwellings on parts of the site that currently have single-storey buildings or caravans would have a greater visual presence and a greater perception of the development, particularly from those vantage points on Lytham Road and West End Lane, which has an impact on openness, a lot of openness due to that increased building scale. There's also those 6 dwellings and garages on parts of the site, which is presently an open grazing paddock. Again, placing buildings on parts of the site that are presently open would be indicative of substantial harm. And as a result of that, there's a degree of encroachment into the countryside because of that southerly spread of development into parts of the site which are presently open, specifically is parcel C rather than parcel 3. And so there's a degree of conflict with one of the purposes of including land within the green belt, which is to assist the countryside from encroachment, or to safeguard the countryside from encroachment. So if there was no mitigation, those impacts would result in a level of harm to the green belt that would be substantial. So that impact needs to be mitigated and reduced to a level that is no longer substantial. And that's been done through a combination of the development layout, having those low density parcels, less intensive forms of development in comparison with the fallback position the larger gaps that you get between these detached dwellings in comparison to those very closely spaced caravans, particularly on the northern parts of the site as parcels A and B. I spoke about the trade-off and the offsetting, which allows the area of the bungalows, the stables and the barn to be returned to open space to make sure that you avoid this fragmentation of development across the site, which would otherwise happen if you were to place buildings exactly on parts of the site that are already occupied, to get this central core of development, and then with these large buffers of open space and landscaping to the site perimeter to screen the development and effectively contain it in views from external vantage points, so that you have the dwelling set back from the boundaries behind this dense woodland planting screen. So the conclusion in the report is that this mitigation is sufficient to reduce the level of harm. There is some harm to the green belt, but that this mitigation is sufficient to reduce the level of harm to a point that it is no longer substantial. So as I mentioned, there's no definition of substantial harm in the framework or the planning practice guidance, though the term presupposes some harm to openness is acceptable in order to deliver affordable housing, but that harm can't meet the threshold of being substantial. So that's a matter of planning judgment as to when the balance is tipped into substantial harm. Just a quick summary of the other matters I mentioned, that there's no other prejudicial impacts on the continued operation of surrounding uses due to that spacing that we've got, particularly with the poultry farm building to the southeast corner of the site and the conclusions in the odour impact assessment. There's various on-site biodiversity enhancements and habitat compensation for bats that's dealt with through a series of conditions. Natural England in the late observations have confirmed that they've no in-principle objections to the updated shadow habitat regulations assessment, subject to the formalisation of that into the appropriate assessment format, which incorporates that mitigation. And there's no other outstanding technical matters in relation to highways, flood risk. The part of the site that's in flood zone 2 and 3 is surrounding the site access to the far southern end, so all the developable areas are within flood zone 1. Aerodrome safeguarding and contamination are also addressed through condition or will be dealt with at reserved matters stage. So the resolution in the agenda papers is to delegate the decision to the head of planning to grant permission subject to a section 106 agreement which will secure infrastructure contributions towards the 30% delivery of affordable housing on the site. Off-site commuted some payments towards secondary education. The Education Authority have identified St Bede's Catholic School in Lytham, and the Integrated Care Board have identified the need for a contribution towards healthcare at Holland House Surgery in Lytham to be fully compliant with the policies in the local plan, plus a monitoring fee for the local authorities' monitoring of those contributions. And secondly, the completion of the appropriate assessment stage of the habitat regulations assessment, which will then have to be reconsulted with Natural England, and the decision could only be issued once their approval is given. So, as I said, the main issue in this case is the impact on the green belt, and we consider that the level of harm arising is adequately mitigated to a level that would not be substantial harm, and on that basis the application's recommended for approval.
Thank you, Matthew. You want to take water?
Yeah, so the parish council, this application was submitted around 12 months ago, January last year. So we consulted the parish council. I should have mentioned in the presentation that when the application was originally submitted, it included up to 62 dwellings. So that's been reduced down to 30 on the advice of officers, principally due to the impact on the Greenbelt. The parish council responded to the original consultation on the 62 dwelling scheme in February, I think it was, 2022. And they expressed that the conclusion was that they had no objections or support for the scheme. It was basically a neutral response that didn't express a particular view either way, although they did make some comments within their representations on some minor kind of matters, but they haven't responded since then. So they were consulted separately on a different iteration of the 62 dwelling scheme in June and July 2022, and on this current scheme that we've got before us for 30 dwellings at the start of December. We haven't received any additional representations from the parish council in response to those two subsequent consultations. So the comments that are reported in the agenda papers are the only response from the parish council that we've had to date.
Council position, but never mind. The NPPF simply asked the question, will there be substantial harm to the Greenbelt on the backs of this application? And the officer, in great detail, has tried to answer that simple question. Open to debate. Councillor Armitt.
I've got a lot of very small little questions. Hopefully they're really easy. In principle, I think it's great. I'm probably happy to propose it and move it. The little questions, if you don't mind. A lot of the three questions are answered by the fact that there'll be social housing put in. We have experienced quite a number of times proposals with social housing in that surprisingly then aren't viable, and the social housing has to be taken out as the developer wants to bring in permission. If that then happens in this case, and then if all the questions then fail, does the planning application then fail because it no longer meets it, or is it just another clever way around that developers can use? There's a number of questions following.
So this decision would be subject to the completion of a planning obligation that secures that affordable housing delivery. Now, with that planning obligation in place, you couldn't come back at reserve matters and reduce the amount of affordable housing without also changing the planning obligation. And if you tried to remove the affordable housing, we would say, well, you no longer qualify for the exception in this second bullet point. It has to be considered against the first bullet point. And the views expressed quite clearly in the report that the development would have a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt, and therefore we wouldn't look favourably on that. So the inclusion of affordable housing goes beyond simply complying with that particular policy of the local plan. It's more fundamental to how we're looking at this in terms of Greenbelt impact. If you weren't doing affordable housing, you're under the first bullet point, which is a much lower level of impact, a lower level of harm that you're allowed to cause. Because it includes the affordable housing, you're benefiting from this not cause substantial harm test. If you weren't doing affordable housing, you wouldn't benefit from that, and the application would be likely to fail as a result.
Next question, please. And I know a lot of these will be just saying, well, it's tough, suck it up. I get that, but I think it's worth always saying it. People don't walk anymore. They just genuinely don't. And where this is being built, if you want a pint of milk at 6 o'clock in the evening, you're going to hop into your car. And I love the idea that 21 cars leave in the morning and only 16 come back at night. I don't know where 5's going every day that aren't coming home in the evening. But if you've got 30 houses here, they will have 2 cars each. They just will. That's how society is now. So we're looking at 60 cars. If you're going to go to school, you're probably going to have mummy dropping or daddy dropping you off, or somebody dropping you off every day. You're not going to be using buses where this is set up. As a runner, I know that area very, very well. And as a fit, fast runner, I love crossing that road. If I take my life in my hands, I'll go for it occasionally. you've got a bus stop on the other side of the road there and you want people to walk across that road, good luck. So that isn't going to happen. So we can expect 60 cars at minimum. We can expect at least 120 journeys a day, 60 in, 60 out. Probably more if they're going to go to a club in the evening or go out for a drink in the evening or go out for get a pint of milk. So in the reality is it's 100 a day. And now there's nothing we can do about that because they've said it's fine and they make up these numbers and they have no idea of the real world. But it's just we have to live in the real world, and that's what we'll be faced with. That's just a rant. There's no need for a response on that because there's nothing you can say. It's Highways Agency are totally clueless. The pond, in terms of pond safety, how will that be managed?
So in terms of, I would just point out that obviously in terms of the access to the bus stop, there is that crossing that's to be introduced as part of the scheme. So that would improve crossing over the road towards the bus stop. Obviously, like you say, the Highway Authority can only use the methodology that's been put before them, and that's the TRIX database that we see. And it's something that's just an established industry standard, effectively. In terms of the ponds, there aren't any proposals to fence off the ponds or anything of that particular nature. It's something that could be introduced at reserve matter stage as part of the landscaping scheme if members thought that was necessary. So it would be it's normally a management company that takes on the open space. So a residence management company would normally maintain open space.
Two drownings in the last couple of months over the winter in small ponds like this near housing estates, the ice. Could that be the management company of the estate's responsibility?
Well, I suppose it's whether or not you want to put. You see, there's a tension there between design guidance that discourages putting up barriers around ponds and things like that, because it wants open access across the site and people to kind of engage, if you like, with nature. And then there's the safety aspect to it. It's really a decision that would be come forward at reserve matters once landscaping is applied for, because that also includes means of enclosure and boundary treatments. If members were so minded at that stage, we could require a condition for a fence to be put up around the pond if members thought that was necessary.
Okay, next one's another one of our clueless advisors with the Highways Agency. As a governor of LSA High, I know we're seeing the numbers drop in the next 5 or 6 years. I know junior schools are seeing numbers drop in the next 5 or 6 years. So know that we're going to be struggling to hit some of our targets, and unless the houses are built to build some targets up again. And yet this is saying, the school needs money because it's got too many pupils. I'm staggered at where that estimate has come from, because that's absolutely not what any schools are seeing around here. So again, it's just a number I guess they pull out of the air, is it? Because it's got nothing to do with reality. Is it?
So these offers quite a lot of places to children with difficulties in learning because the two are much wider catchment area.
Okay.
So every year you do get some big schools regardless.
Right, I'll take it back. That's fine. Didn't know that. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chris. What's the last one? Just on an interesting one for me, that 1980s photograph you showed of the cleared land still showed roads, and it still showed hard standing, and it still showed you could see the outlines of where buildings had been. How is that classified as cleared and now back to nature, when you absolutely on the right there you've got roads, hard standing, and that to me looks like an empty cleared buildings, but a developed area, but that doesn't count as developed.
Yeah, so the absence of buildings is what's key to that, with respect to the definition of previously developed land. So it's that exclusion at the end. So land which was previously developed, but where the remains of the permanent structure or fixed surface structure have blended into the landscape.
That doesn't include roads.
No, in terms of, but you've got to have, if you go back to the starting point, you've got to have land which was occupied by a permanent structure. So you've got to have a building on there that it needs to relate to. So if you've cleared your site and all that's left is it's unclear from this image whether or not, what extent these roads were still in place, and what the state of them was, whether you ratted over, is this just a kind of ordnance survey plan that indicates these roads that were previously in place within this site, what was the actual reality of what was on site at the time. It's unclear from that image, but what we can see is that all the buildings that were previously there in this image have gone and been demolished and cleared away from the site. So that's the key issue there in terms of the definition of previously developed land.
My last point is, again, a very selfish one for me. That fantastic huge hedge that runs along the outside of it, who will be responsible for the maintenance of that once it becomes private land?
Which hedge in particular?
Private
That
sector along the main road.
on Lytham Road?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's within the site. So that's to be retained as part of the scheme.
Because at the moment the cuttings are so awful, basically you can't use a cycle park because you're touching the tires at the moment. So I just wondering, will it be maintained or is it just going to go wild?
Yeah, it's to be maintained as part of the landscaping as well. So it would again be the management company that also maintains the trees, does the pruning.
Management fees for the houses that live on here.
Yeah.
I'm happy to approve.
Vice Chairman.
The first comment I want to make is that there have been a lot of discussions recently in terms of the planning advisory review about all sort of aspects of planning within Fylde. And one of the aspects that came up for some discussion were the sort of level of detail of officer reports. And I just wanted to, and I hope members share this, tell me if you don't, but in particular with an application of this complexity, with the issues around the green belt, etc., exceptions and mitigations and all the rest of it. If you have read the report, the written report, and then listened to the presentation presented this morning by Matthew, that level of detail answers so many questions that we would have had today to ask. And in some ways that sort of perhaps restricts the debate a little bit, but perhaps restricts unnecessary debate rather than valid and legitimate debate, because the detail and the presentation of this report has been such that so many things have already been answered. And I would like to thank the officer for his diligence in terms of preparing this report and delivering it. The big question here, which I think has been effectively answered, is that we're all aware of the status of Greenbelt. It's sacrosanct almost, and the exceptions are limited. And it is a planning judgment, as Matthew has rightly sort of said. So there's always a level of subjectivity in terms of these judgments. But in terms of the exceptions for, not developing within the green belt, he's really very clearly demonstrated that certainly from, I think it was 92, discounting the RAF development, I know, this is definitely previous used land. Those of you that were able to get to the site visit, and can I just say the importance of the site visit, I think this morning as well, for those of you that could go, really demonstrated that this is previously used land and it's a mess. I'm sorry, I'm not using a technical term there, but it if anything is an eyesore, this site is. And the only reason it isn't a more substantial eyesore is because of the already inherited amount of woodland and screening that there is of this site, which helps in terms of determining this when we know that there's going to be a lot of landscaping and additional tree planting right around, particularly the eastern, I think, and the southern areas of this site. But we know it's previously used land. The second exception is about affordable housing. There is a given need. We've heard, you know, the surveys that have taken place demonstrate that very clearly. And the 30% rule is being applied. So we have 9 out of the 30 dwellings that are going to be created here. And then that third aspect, which is a planning judgment about, you know, we know that there is going to be some negative impact in terms of this development compared with its existing use or non-use. Because we've heard, I think, a 5% increase in footprint, 29% in volume and height. That said, the judgment in terms of substantial harm is a judgment that has not been reached. And I agree with that. I really do agree with that. And the other point I want to make is when we're looking at this, it's the mitigatory measures that are put in place. For example, technically this isn't a mitigatory thing, but there was a consideration of a previous application, I think, for sort of 65 houses that was being discussed and a proposal. This now is 30, which is much more manageable and therefore has less intrusion in terms of amenity to residents, etc., and other effects it has. Walking around the site again today, we saw that. I think the way in which, I mean, because this is one thing, layout and scale, that is part of this, even though it's an outline application, you know, there are some almost reserved matters coming in here, but outline, the layout and the scale is such that it's very sensitively designed, I think, the layout with these sort of 3 pods, if you like. I know about the 6 units being in slightly open grazed land. We also know about the fact that, you know, the entrance is in a flood zone 3. But when you look at the arrangements in terms of attenuation and drainage, etc., I'm confident that won't be a problem. You look at the landscaping being suggested in terms of the extra vegetation and woodland and open spaces. We've heard that the extant planning permission is about, I think, 49, 46, one way or another, of touring caravans and statics. But they're all regimented and all up against each other. These dwellings are sympathetically spaced, you know, looking out, gardens sort of facing each other. The road network is sympathetic, I think, to this particular site. And I really do think that this particular development that's being recommended this morning for approval by our officers will actually transform a fairly ugly eyesore into a very sympathetically designed residential development. And, you know, a good mixture of housing tenure. We've got 3 bedroom, we've got 4 bedroom, we've got 5 bedroomed, but it meets, I think you said the H2 thing, about 50% have to be 3 bedrooms, I think. So it meets that as well. And I would like to say that I think this is a distinct improvement, and I do think it genuinely does meet the exceptions for development on the green belt. So I'd like to second. No, it's been moved by Councillor Armitt, so I'd like to support that and second the application.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I think we've got to add to what the Vice Chairman has said, not to forget the extant planning permissions that already exist. Linda.
No, apologies, I didn't get to the meeting this morning. It was my health or standing out, and I decided I was not standing out there. I do know this site because, of course, we've had site visits before. I've also been to events on that site that, and I know it's a complete mess, and you know, I agree that anything that can be done to tidy it up has got to be positive. The one thing that does concern me, affordable housing is great, social exclusion isn't. And my worry, and I see this a lot, affordable housing out where there are no shops, the schools are, you know, Councillor Armitt says nobody will get on a bus. They will have to get on a bus. The children from that estate will have to get on a bus to go to a primary school or to go to a secondary school. And it does worry me that, I mean, fortunately, I believe there's good bus routes. I think that's in the report. So fortunately that is, but it should be a consideration in things that we do, that we are socially excluding families. And very often people in affordable properties, they're not just families. There's also disabled people and what have you. And it is it's a concern of mine that, yeah, affordables are good, but they need to be in the right place. And that needs, you know, it's all a sustainability. I know the chairman loves the word sustainability, but it is part of sustainability that people can access what they need to access. And it's quite, I know there's Lidl down the road or whatever, and it's not that far to shops and things, but it's a long way if you're walking with a toddler in a pushchair and what have you. So that's a slight concern. However, good to see them. And like Councillor Armitt said, that has to be set in concrete that those things happen. The other thing is this, the mix of...
Sustainable development. You could argue very effectively that this is not sustainable development for the reasons you just given.
Yeah,
But when we were first confronted with residential developments in the local plan, the Hollywood Nursery site out at Whitehills was definitely not sustainable development,
no,
and yet the Inspector of Appeal granted it. So there has been instances and examples
yeah.
of developments which
And that's
technically
what I'm saying, that you know, and I see this, and the ones on I know it's another area, but Blackpool Road in Kirkham, where there's a lot of affordable housing, very few buses, people not able to access the town centre easily. I see it a lot, and sustainability. I know you don't believe in it and all that, but you know, it's something that we should take into account. However, I do think that this, you know, it's a good thing. But the one thing I question is 4 and 5, more 4 and 5. I know it's meeting the criteria that 50% are three bedded, but more and more and more of 4-bedded and 5-bedded dwellings with a very low density. Do we need them? Wharton is absolutely stuffed with new developments, a lot of which 4 and 5 bedroom dwellings, huge houses. And I still think, you know, all right, we've got 50% now, but I still think there's room for making it more smaller dwellings. That's just my opinion. And, you know, who buys these things, I don't know. But there's a lot of families that can't buy because half of the estate is beyond them. Well, yeah. However, so yeah, it's my opinion. Well, and I think it will come that some of these 4 and 5 beds won't be sold because the need is not for those. But at least we're addressing some of it. So the question was then, you said it's sort of set in stone with this layout, but this is only outline. Can it be changed at reserve matters? Could the developer come back and say, actually, I want 40 houses, not 30?
Well,
Right.
do you
So
want me
this
to
is
answer that?
usually with reserve matters, you know, well, with outline, it's sort of there and you get an indicative thing. and then it comes back, but you're saying it's set at 30, yeah?
Yeah, so the number of dwellings is a maximum
Right.
that's been applied for at this stage. So it's up to 30 dwellings. So the only scenario is it either would have to be 30 or less.
Right,
In terms of the layout and the scale, it's particularly important with the layout that's fixed at this stage, because it's very important where the buildings are positioned on the site to avoid, extensions into these kind of open areas here, for example. So we insisted at the time that the application was submitted that layout was applied for at this stage, and then scale feeds into the assessment of volume, just that kind of mathematical assessment. So that's really the background as to why
So
we
it's-
required those three particular matters to be applied for at this stage. So any application for reserved matters would have to come in accordance with this in terms of layout and the maximum scale parameters. Those dimensions couldn't be exceeded at reserved matters. Obviously, it's open to any developer to come back with a full planning application subsequently and apply for something different. But in terms of any reserved matters application must follow this layout, and it must not exceed the maximum number of dwellings and the scale parameters that are within this application.
okay. And the only other question I had was the piece of land that you said is going to be a trade-off open space for the grazing land that is lost. Would that open space just be open land, or would it, because there are stables somewhere, aren't there, and would it be grazing land, or would it just be open space?
It's in, again, because we're not dealing with landscaping, we don't have the kind of formal,
Right.
how this area is going to be treated specifically. But this indicative landscaping plan shows this as informal open space with this additional woodland planting around the fringes of it. As I mentioned, it's very much a case of it doesn't make sense to locate dwellings in this parcel on this part where the bungalows are and this part where the stables are. It's much cleaner and better for the design strategy to include them here.
Yeah, I just wondered about the stables. Is there land adjacent to the stables where the horses
There's
can go?
a riding arena here,
Right.
and there's some hard standing at the front here that's basically car parking and vehicle manoeuvring, so that would have to be returned to some form of open space, whether it's just grassed over, whether it's kind of seeded with like wildflowers or something like that. That level of detail will come when landscaping is applied for.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman, just to confirm for the market, the tables go around.
Yes. Yeah,
Sorry.
there's also a condition, just to clarify, there is a condition on...
Oh, the stables go.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've missed that.
Yeah, there's a condition on the in the schedule that requires all the existing buildings to be demolished and
Oh, so
removed
there
from
are
the
no-
site. Yeah.
So there's still a riding area, but
No,
those
that's what's there at the moment. So
Oh.
that would be
that would be open
removed
space.
and returned to green space. basically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Chairman. I just wanted to echo the Vice Chairman's sentiments. I mean, what a comprehensive report. It's fantastic, really. Any questions that I had, I think, have been thoroughly answered. I'm surprised more than anything that we've not seen someone come in and try and fit 100 houses on there the way things have been going recently. And I think they did try with 60 and our officers have got it down to 30, which I think is a fantastic compromise. 'Cause I know it's classified as green belt, but we're kidding ourselves, aren't we? I wasn't on the trip this morning, but I've been on there several times. It still looks like an abandoned RAF base. And it looks like, somewhere that car boots have been, in the past have held. It's an absolute mess. It's not Greenbelt. However, Greenbelt comes in very handy because it puts that tie in there with the affordable housing which we need, and it stops anyone crawling out of their obligations with that. So I'm quite happy to support, Chair.
Chair. Regarding the reserve matter, will we get notification of those as a general rule? Just so as it moves forward and gets on it, would we be notified of how they've gone, and just to reiterate that it has been done to plan?
It'll come back.
It'll come back.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Exactly what Chris and the Vice Chairman said in terms of the presentation. I've always been in favour of a comprehensive report. It does help the committee. There are those who argue differently, but I think they're in the minority. Now, in terms of, before we go to the vote, just to remind committee of the resolution and recommendation. And that recommendation is described on page 76. And the recommendation is that it be delegated to the Chief Planning Officer. And I would like to add, and in all instances where this is a case of delegation to the Chief Planning Officer, that it be in consultation with the Chairman and Vice Chairman. So with that in mind, moved by Councillor Armitt, seconded by the Vice Chairman. All in favour, please show. Clearly unanimous, thank you. Can we move on? Russell's Yard, I believe it's in Ansell, Vice Chairman.
Yes.
Okay, item 2, final item, relates to a site at Russell's Yard in Ansdell. I think it probably is, isn't it, Ansdell?
It is.
So it's the red circle on the square on the screen there. So just to locate yourself, obviously you've got Royal Lytham Golf Course here, Woodlands Road and Ansdell Station there, and this is Blackpool Road and the Rugby Club. So we're in a predominantly built-up area. Predominantly residential built-up area, albeit this site and this scheme is in a commercial use. So it's, as I say there, it's a pocket of commercial development in Ansdell. There's currently a derelict building on site and other commercial buildings on sort of another part of the site. It's in the settlement area, and this scheme is to put a replacement building on the site, which provides a terrace of 4 units for either Class B8, which is storage and distribution, or Class E, light industrial uses. As it was first submitted, the application included a larger building, which was to be split into 6 units, and also included the proposal to use it for Class B2 use, which is a general industrial use. That application generated quite a lot of public reaction, petitions and letters and the like, concerned about the scale of the building, the volume of traffic that would be created, and the potential for noise and other nuisance impacts from a general industrial use. So we shared those concerns as officers, and hence the scheme's been sort of reduced in its scale physically and reduced in its use in terms of amenity risk potentials to the storage and storage and light industrial uses that we now have. This application is of a scale that could be delegated, but we brought it to committee given the level of public opposition or public interest that it attracted initially, albeit we haven't had anything like the same level of interest to the notification on the revised scheme. And offer recommendations for approval. So this is an aerial image that zooms into that area. So you can see that these properties are all residential. The application site is essentially that lighter building there and the land around it. So these other buildings in this area are all in commercial use. What you've got here is a block of residential apartments, another residential apartments here, and then you've got a long terrace of garages that presumably go with these residential properties. So if you look onto the plan, you've got the flats, you've got the driveway to them, and then you've got this garage. So they form one boundary of the site, and the proposal is to put a building alongside that. So if I just show you some pictures, then you can see the site to get the context of that. So this cream building is the building with the white roof you could see on the images. So that's to be removed, and the building that goes on site goes in its place. Utilises the existing access point. This building is retained, and then the building effectively is a slightly larger version of this cream one. Looking at it, this is the block of flats, the apartments, this is the garages, so you can see that relationship to those nearest residential properties, and those were primarily where the objections to the initial scheme came from. Looking at it the other way, back towards the access point, this is the other side of the cream building, so you can see that whilst it might look all right from the road, it looks less all right from the back. Obviously, parts of the buildings have collapsed, and the site is all underused and relatively derelict. You see the residential flats here that I've mentioned, 3-storey block, and then this is the back of the garage, the end of the terrace of garages. Another view internally, so you can see the building on site is largely, it has been in industrial use, and the site has that industrial planning history as a result, but it's not in an active use at present. So the scheme that goes in its place is this. So the access point stays as is. Some parking provided on the forecourt, some parking provided internally, and then this building, these 4 units provided along that boundary with the back of the garages beyond, and then the residential flats beyond them. Visually, looks like industrial units. A single story of accommodation with a mono-pitched roof to provide space for industrial activity to take place. This is it's a street scene view. So going back to the first picture I showed you, looking at the site. So you've got the flats, driveway, garages, and then this is the existing cream building, and then that shows the scale of the replacement building. These buildings are the existing buildings on site that aren't being affected. So what this is intended to show is that ridge point is the same as that point there. So whilst the eaves have increased slightly, so the eaves of the garages are somewhere where my red point is there, and the ridge would be somewhere there. The idea of this design is to ensure that your occupier of the ground floor flat there has a relatively unchanged aspect from what they have in the current situation with that pitched roof building. So whilst the building is larger and it goes to a higher point, it's going away from the eye line of the occupiers of those flats. And I think that was a key point that we were keen to get to, given that you have this two-storey building, it's to try and maintain that open aspect whilst allowing a more effective use of that site than is currently available. So it's in the settlement. So planning policy directs us towards supporting effective redevelopment of sites that are located in the settlements, particularly the main settlement, Lytham St Anne's. The site has a commercial use, and the use that's now proposed as a B8 and light industrial class EG use would be more benign form of activity than that which is currently possible if the B2 use was to be the general industrial use was to be re-established. The building, as I say, is larger, but not massively so. It's not filling the site entirely or anything like that. Still gives circulation space, and it's using a mixture of brick and cladding to reflect the brick that you could see on the existing buildings, and obviously cladding to reflect that it's a commercial building, so it needs to have that material. From an amenity point of view, the change in the use to storage or to light industrial uses is the definition of light industrial use is one that is capable of being undertaken in a residential area. So that effectively confirms that the amenity impacts are going to be acceptable. And then I've demonstrated about the scale and the light issues, how that relates to the existing properties. The site access is existing. It is not the greatest access, but it's an existing site that is accessible, and the Highway Authority have not raised any objections. The scheme provides sufficient level of parking for the anticipated use, and so the highway issues are felt to be acceptable. And with all that being said, we're recommending the application be approved.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, I'll come in with some sort of comments here. This particular, I think this particular application and the way that officers have dealt with it is a really positive way in terms of dealing with applications, because the first application, which was very different to this one, and I'm going to point to a few things here, that the application that's presented that we're going to be determining now has changed quite significantly from the first one, and that's partly, I think, taking on board concerns that were expressed into petitions and objections that were made by local residents. Got to understand that this is in a settlement area, it's in a residential area, but there is long-standing use in this area as well of commercial operations and enterprises, garages, print shops, etc. And the first thing I want to say is that this particular application now has had, for example, the BT use removed, which would have led to more aggressive, perhaps, usages and therefore greater impact in terms of neighbourhood amenity. You've gone from 6 to 4 units, 2 have been removed. One of the big issues that was pointed out by local residents was, I think, in the first scheme, only 6 units, 6 parking or 5 or whatever, something like that. Now it's 13, so more than double, and that is often a big sort of conflict for local businesses that operate in sort of quite constrained areas, with some residential properties being affected by it. The mass of the building has been reduced from the previous application. Okay, albeit slightly larger than what we see here at the moment. There is landscaping, hedging, better use, I think, of space here. It's also believed that the proposed users would have little impact in terms of neighbourhood amenity. I like particularly the fact that one of the affected buildings, the Rutland sort of court, the flats, and that, as you've seen, where you have that bank of garages there, they would be overlooking. And what they've done is that sort of what I call the mono-pitched roof, which stays low in front of the flats and then goes higher as it goes away from the flats. Also the rustic brick which they're using on the frontage, and I think that what they call Merlin grey panels should be, I think, should, compared with the present theme that you have, should actually contribute to a much improved street theme, which is something that is mentioned in the report. But the real thing that I love about this is that this is a very much revised application that has been partly informed by residents' comments, a review of what we think is suitable and appropriate here. And I very much hope that you look at a site like this and you might say to residents, well, this is a much more preferable proposition than perhaps others in terms of noise and pollution, etc. And you've got fewer units, you've got your parking sorted out, the monopitch, roof. And I think it now provides you with an application that I feel is acceptable, and I would move approval of this, subject obviously to.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Before I bring the Tim, you were indicating you wish to speak.
Yeah, just a quick question, really. Why has this come here? I mean, if it's a lot of complaints from the locals, but they're not valid planning complaints, are we just too nice? And so we say, that's interesting, thank you, noted your complaint. But I don't understand why this has come to this committee.
There's perhaps two questions there. The original application, as the chairman said, would have been recommended for refusal because the residents were right that the scheme was too big, the scope of the uses were too harmful. So that was unacceptable, and we got to the point where we revised the plan. The reason it's come to committee is as I said in the earlier presentation, it may look as though we've tried to pad out the agenda so we had more than one application on it, but that's generally not the reason. But it was an application. It's in Lytham. There isn't a parish council in Lytham, and I'm conscious that not that many applications from Lytham do come here. Okay. It's in the unparished area of the borough, and I'm conscious that in comparison with perhaps the parished areas, we don't have as many applications here in front of the committee, and it sort of did attract quite a lot of public interest from when it was originally submitted. Now we may well have, because of the modifications, have addressed all those concerns. Some of them were, yeah. The scale, the level of the use, the highway impacts, the parking.
The first one which you got rid of. This one is on. I'm happy to say. It's just we seem to be so nice to people instead of saying that's very interesting. Move on.
I think, yeah.
Glad we are.
Thanks, Chairman. I think, one of the reasons it's come as well is because in its original form, I asked Andrew if it could come, because as a ward councillor, not on the planning committee at the time, I had a lot of people get in touch. They were concerned about it being a big delivery depot with, multiple cars going in and out all the time. The building was too big. And thanks to the officers working on this and getting it to a level where I think I had one phone call after the revised plans went in, and since then nothing. But we've given those residents the opportunity to come and stand there today if they want, to say they're not happy with it. There's none of them here, because I think the officers have done a great job in revising the scheme, getting it down. There's 4 units there now. They're clearly not of a size where there's going to be 20 vans going to each one every day. Otherwise, there'd be bigger units. I think the residents are happier. We're going to get a nice little scheme there, and hopefully some more people in them that will walk the 25 metres to the shops on Woodland Road and use the businesses there. So, yeah.
Lunch is served.
You will have received your agendas for next
Yeah.
29 committee. If you're printing them off, make sure you've got plenty of paper in it.
I've already advised them to bring the night attire.
So, but yeah, so what I was just saying, it is quite a heavy agenda. Quite a lot of it is information items, so don't be too phased with it. Yeah, 2 of the items are just supplementary planning documents, which we've previously visited. But I was just saying, because there is quite a lot on the agenda, if you've got any questions ahead of, that come to your mind if you're looking through the agenda, you want to, obviously, you always on to these, please do contact us so that we can answer any questions ahead. Maybe the meeting itself.
It really is a case of feast or famine. We've had to cancel previous planning policy meetings because of a lack of agenda. This one takes us to the other extreme.
I think we're introduced there, so.
They'll be in the pipeline.